Today, you're going to learn how to make giant mushrooms that will add color and life to any setting. We will be using simple materials and techniques, and step by step you will end up with these incredible pieces, full of detail and color.
Hey crafters! Welcome back to HANDCRAFTED. Today we're making something fun, versatile and a little magical. Modular mushrooms with interchangeable tops.
Okay, forget about the interchangeable tops. I thought it would be a cool idea at first, but after a while I realized it wasn't really worth the effort.
That's what she said!
These mushrooms are perfect for adding some whimsy to your forest or a touch of mystery to your cavern. And you've got a multi-purpose piece of terrain that's as dynamic as your imagination. So, let's go crafting!
The first step is to outline the shapes of the mushroom caps on an XPS foam sheet. Make them in various sizes, large, medium and small. You can use a miniature as a reference to decide the dimensions. Once everything is marked, proceed with freehand cutting using a proxon or, if unavailable, a knife. Don't worry about being precise, as these shapes have to look organic and natural. Continue slicing thinner pieces until you have as many caps as the mushrooms you plan to make. Now, using a hot wire cutter, refine the shapes as shown in the video. Give them a slight conical shape, leaving a flat portion in the middle to attach the mushroom stem later. For the cap's top part, I will use a wood burning tool to slightly melt the central area. Set the tool to the lowest temperature and ensure you're working in a ventilated space while wearing a mask. The next step is to create lines on the underside of the caps to represent the gills that hold the spores. Carefully crave the lines all the way around. Then use the tool on the edges and on the cap's outer surface to add extra texture. Start with the largest mushrooms, as they are easier to handle. This will help you get comfortable with the techniques before moving on to smaller ones, which require extra care to avoid burns. If you don't have a wood burning tool, you can use a hot knife or a carving tool as an alternative. Use a good mask and not the shitty one I was using for this. If you can smell through it, then it's not working. By the way, if any melted foam bits remain and you don't like how they look, you can easily remove them with a modeling blade. However, it's not necessary to remove them, as they will hardly be noticeable once everything is painted. Now let's create the bases for our mushrooms. My idea is to make clusters with several mushrooms grouped together. To get a sense of the size, I place several caps together and mark the foam with a pen. We will make freehand cuts with the hot wire cutter, aiming to give the bases an organic and curvilinear shape. Next, slice the pieces in half. This will leave mine at 2 cm height. Perfect! Now it's time to add texture. The technique you see me using is the same one I use for the stackers in my modular cave system. You can check out that video here. These mushrooms can work as an expansion for that system, but they can also be used in any other setting. Once we're done adding texture with the pliers, we will use a rock and a foil ball to texture the top surface. Alright, now let's move on to the mushroom stems. To make them, I will use scraps from the cave project, as I still have plenty saved and this is a great way to repurpose them. Using the proxon, I will cut them in various shapes, some wider, others taller and more slender, and many of them curved or tilted. To achieve a more interesting texture, I use a lighter to melt the outer foam layer. Be careful and pass the flame very lightly. If foam is exposed to heat for too long, it will completely melt, which is not what we want. We are just aiming to round off the edges and give the piece a more uniform texture. Remember, whenever you're using heat with foam, wear a mask and work in a ventilated area. Great! Now it's time to start gluing. We will attach each stem to its respective cap using hot glue. Initially, I considered using magnets to allow swapping caps, but I realized it wasn't worth the extra effort for pieces that aren't part of any main system. Carefully glue everything together and leave the mushrooms upside down while the glue pulls. For the thinner stems, you can reinforce the edge of the joint with a bit of extra glue. Once painted, it won't be noticeable. Glue patiently until you finish assembling all the mushrooms before moving to the next step. Finally, I decide to glue some of the mushrooms to their bases. On one hand, I like how they look, but I quickly realized that this was a complete mistake. It will now be much harder to paint. So instead, we're going to paint the individual components first and then glue everything together afterward.
Alright, the crafting is done and now it's time to bring those mushrooms to life with paint. This can fit both forest and cave environments, so I will be using a mix of natural tones and vibrant colors for the cap, and probably some light colors for the rest of the parts. But before we dive into painting, if you're enjoying this video or finding inspiration, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It's a small click for you, but a big boost for me, helping keep these creative projects coming your way. Now let's grab those brushes and make those mushrooms pop.
To start the paint job, we will follow the usual routine. Apply a couple of coats of primer made from black acrylic paint mixed with PVA glue. This will provide a good surface for the colors to adhere to, create a dark tone that will serve as shadows and harden the foam, making it more resistant to damage. Once the base coat is completely dry, begin painting the gills and stem with fawn. For the gills, use the overbrush technique, leaving the black still visible in the grooves. When dry, apply a dry brush with buttermilk to add depth and highlight the edges. Use a small amount of paint and apply soft brush strokes. Next, paint the cap top with honey brown. Feel free to choose any color you like, but I was aiming for the look of what we call arrubello in Catalan. I'm not sure what it's called in English, but here's the mushroom I mean. Once it's dry, follow up with a yellow dry brush to add more texture. After painting the individual mushrooms, I also had to paint the ones already glued to the base. Although it's doable, it's slower and I had to be more careful. So if you make this craft, I highly recommend painting everything separately and gluing it afterward. Next, I painted the bases. Again, I followed the same pattern as for the modular caves. Start with a brown overbrush across the entire piece. Once dry, apply a dry brush with honey brown, focusing on the edges and certain areas here and there to make the color less uniform. I followed the same process for the cluster that was already glued. After finishing the painting, I decided to create much smaller mushrooms to use as extra details later on. For this, I used some styrofoam balls I had purchased a while ago to simulate spider eggs. By the way, this piece is inspired by a very old video from Black Magic Craft. To make the mushrooms, I cut the balls in half and glued them onto a piece of toothpick using hot glue. This gave me some little cute mushrooms. I made quite a few and then apply a couple of coats of white paint. I left them to dry on a non-stick paper and move on to the next part of the project. Alright, now it's finally time to glue everything together. With all the pieces painted, this step will be much easier. Heat up your hot glue gun and let's get started. I recommend beginning with the larger mushrooms, then moving on to the medium ones and so on. This way you can create better compositions, making the pieces look more interesting and dynamic. I really enjoy this part of the project because this is where everything starts to come to life. Also, thank you very much to my patrons. Your help is really much appreciated, and it will make possible for me to continue purchasing tools and supplies I need for making these videos. You are the best! Once everything was glued in place, I decided to apply a couple of washes to finish off the paint job. These washes are homemade, and I explain how to make them in this quick 2-minute video. I used a bit of brown wash for the caps and a bit of green wash on the bases and stems to help everything blend together nicely. Now it's time for the moss. one of my favorite parts of this type of craft. I will be using sponge foliage, which you can either buy pre-made or create yourself. For this project, I use a couple of different shades to achieve a more interesting and natural look. First, mix the foliage with PVA glue until you get a paste-like consistency. If the mixture is too thick, you can add a bit of water. Once it's ready, start applying it to the piece. Make sure to place it in a way that looks as organic as possible. I highly recommend covering the seams between the mushrooms and the base, especially if any hot glue has seeped out. This will help disguise any small imperfections. You can also add bits of moss here and there, on the caps, the stems and other areas, to enhance the overall texture and detail. With the moss still wet, it's time to add the tiny white mushrooms. Using pliers, carefully press them into areas where moss has been applied. These mushrooms will hold firmly on their own, but placing them in wet glue ensures they will be extra secure once everything dries. If you have mushrooms without a pointed base, simply trim them diagonally with a pair of cutting pliers, and they will be ready to attach. This step is all about adding those final details that bring the piece to life, creating a more polished and realistic effect. I left the pieces drying overnight before considering the project finished, and now all that's left is to take a look at the final result in a couple of different environments.
And there you have it, modular mushrooms ready to enhance any terrain setup. Whether you're decorating a mystical forest or a dark cavern, these pieces add that extra touch of magic and versatility to your games. If you want to support the channel and get access to exclusive content like templates, behind the scenes looks, and early access to my project, be sure to check out my Patreon. Your support keeps the crafting magic alive. And if you want to see more, try giving a look to one of these two videos. I'm sure the algorithm will surprise you with something interesting. Thank you so much for watching. Stay creative, keep crafting, and I will see you in the next video.